Good afternoon. Hey! So when I was asked to do this by John and Ellen, I had to come to the realization of two things. One, they wanted me to answer the simple and easy question of why housing matters. And the second was I knew I was going to be the only thing between 400 people and cocktail hour. So we'll try to keep this as light as possible, but we want to talk about a few key things here. Why does housing matter? I want to talk about this in terms of not only housing as a typology, but really what a home means to us, specifically here in the Midwest. We spend a lot of time in our office trying to understand the connection between people and places. And it's a passion of ours where we really try to focus on understanding how the built environment imposes itself on the people it hopes to serve. And it allows us to start to think through some of these key strategies and understanding what are the most effective scenarios for people of all ages and abilities, and kind of run that full spectrum of what we'll call quality of life, which I want to talk about a little bit today. But in that, I think the idea of this home, this phenomenon of your house, plays a really important part in that equation. So humans are hardwired to cooperate, right? Cooperation is a currency of the human species. Whether we care to admit it or not, that's what we're programmed to do. The problem is we consistently try to convince ourselves we're independent, right? Which has fallen on its face a little bit here in recent times. So I think when you're asking big philosophical questions like why does housing matter, I think it's helpful to step back. So if we're going to step back, let's step all the way back. A couple 100,000 years ago, humans as a species became one of the few species on the planet that can fill two criteria. One is we're a complex social system, and the other is what biologists will call a nesting habit. Like there's a common place where we all go, a campground. It's the only thing that turned us into hunters and gatherers. And over a millennia or so, we've evolved in trying to understanding what that meant in the realm of public engagement and in community development. And that nesting philosophy, that instinct that's in you, has really kind of shaped the trajectory of development across the country. And having that nest as part of how you define the world as your kind of frame of reference has really become, I think, an important thing to revisit now, especially after the pandemic. So we're trying to understand these reciprocal relationships, this idea of cooperating with others, where and how we build our homes can empower us or limit our ability to do so. This is the American dream, right? In some way, it's always kind of confused this idea of isolation and independence. Right? We kind of prove to ourselves we're independent by how isolated we can be. And over the years, we've kind of, through a whole bunch of different phenomena, gotten in this habit of qualifying success by how many amenities we can privatize. Right? A really good home or success could be measured by, I live in a house that has a home gym, home theater, home office, home school. Right? I don't need anybody or anything. I'm a state unto myself. And then we spend a lot of energy trying to build an economy around us that helps pretend like we're connected. Right? This is the reason Zuckerberg's a billionaire. So how do we play this game in a more sustainable way and understand this glorification of independence is causing a few problems? So we saved the hard-hitting data for the last section. So this is the rise and decline of league bowling in America. I know this is why you all came. Somewhere in the 60s it peaked, and since then it's dropped to almost being non-existent. What's interesting about this is I can do this for almost any social organization, and the curve looks about the same. Right? Boy Scouts, VFW, you name it. Somewhere in the 60s it peaked, and it correlated with how we were building our communities. Somewhere in the 60s we started building communities that made it really cumbersome to participate in social activities. Right? And that participation plummeted. And with every curve there's an interesting counter curve. So while that was happening, the screen goes dark. Maybe. Maybe not. So the inverse of that curve is the rise of chronic disease in America. So you can track the growth of suburban sprawl with that yellow line with things like obesity, heart disease, teenage suicide. Right? Eerily mimics the growth of suburban sprawl. So while we were doing this to ourselves and stopping engaging in those social ways, it also is having a huge toll on our health and well-being. Now you can make anything look like they're correlated to prove a point. Here's the correlation between swimming pool drownings and Nicolas Cage movies. there's a drastic and dangerous habit of confusing correlation and causation, right? I can make any two things look like they're probably related. So when you're talking about community development, this is a pretty bad habit a lot of people get into. But there are some trends that I think are undeniable. So when we look at things like social determinants of health, right, we understand that about 60%, north of 60% of those determinants have something to do with the factors that define your everyday routine, right? Your personal behaviors, your neighborhood, that kind of thing. If you want to know how long you're going to live, your zip code is much more useful information than your genetic code, which is sad, and I think an indictment on how we've built our communities over the last 50 to 60 years. And we have to understand that the way in which we develop, manage, and operate communities really imposes on the people that we claim we're serving a certain quality of life, and we got to get better at understanding what that means. So there was some mention this morning of Gallup Wellbeing Index, right? So in thinking about well-being, especially in the context of community development, Gallup will define it across 5 sectors. Purpose, liking what you do each day. Social well-being, having supportive relationships and love in your life. 3 is financial well-being, having the economic ability to reduce stress. 4 is community well-being, liking where you live and having some pride in the place in which you call home. And finally, 5th is the actual physical well-being, right? And you can measure metro areas or communities across these 5 sectors. Gallup also does it in terms of maps, so they can give scores for each state. And when they first started doing this in 2015, 2016, there was this pocket of states that were in the bottom quartile, that we would affectionately refer to as the Midwest. It's kind of this black hole of the unwell. Over the last 5 or 6 years, that kind of pocket has moved south slightly. We're in that Mississippi, Alabama region. What's interesting also, in 2016, they did the same study and analysis across these 5 sectors for metro areas. There was 180 cities. In 2016, Fort Wayne placed 180th out of 180 in social well-being, which is a question to ask if you had love in your life. Our scores have gotten better since then, but it's a reality that we have to face. And we have to understand how our communities are not helping this situation at all. The other thing we have to understand is that's the current state. What happens when we look towards the future? Between 2005 and 2040, our state's population is projected to grow by about 15%. During that same time, our 65 and older population is projected to grow by about 90%. That's a state average. So in second-tier cities, Auburn, Garrett, Kendallville, those will probably be closer to 130%. So, quick show of hands. How many people live within walking distance of buying toilet paper? How many people know the person that sold them the toilet paper? 1. 2. So when we talk about livable communities and you reconcile that with the fact that by 2040, a third of our population probably shouldn't be or can't drive, we have ourselves a problem, right? We have to understand what that means and how we're going to fix it from an economic development standpoint. One of the ways to do it is when we think about public health is to think about having more leadership upstream. So when we talk about public health, I think the general consensus and instinct is talk about downstream services, healthcare, social services, those things that react to disease, injury, like known factors and results. What we're looking for is trying to understand in a more sophisticated way how this idea of effective community planning can move more upstream, talking about social inequities at the planning and strategic level, right? And understanding what that means for the future of our communities and the role housing plays in that discussion. So the thing I want to talk about today, especially when it comes to housing, is this idea that there's become a more and more mounting evidence that a network of face-to-face relationships can create this kind of biological force field against disease. And I think that's really important to understand, that the physical contact is what matters here. Not counting your friends by how many people are connected to you on LinkedIn or Facebook. We're talking physical relationships. And I'll use some research that I can share in more detail if anybody's interested. But if you look at the 10 factors that can reduce your chances of premature death, there's a list of 10, some of which you probably can guess. You know, lose weight, take medication, exercise, don't eat bad foods. The top 2 are these 2. And they're top 2 by a large margin. First one is having close relationships, having real intimate friends that you see on a regular and repeatable basis. The second is social integration, feeling like you belong to a group larger than your immediate and bonded relationships. So A, I have friends I care about. B, I live in a neighborhood I'm proud of, right, to simplify it. Those 2 things are the 2 top factors reduce the chances of you premature dying. But when we talk about quality of life, I never really see this come up, right, in real terms. And it's interesting because without those two, you start to see the side effects of loneliness. And if it was given the attention it deserves, I do think that loneliness could and should be considered a national emergency. So even before COVID, these are 2019 numbers, about half of us actually had what we thought were meaningful relationships and physical conversations on a daily basis with a friend. About half. Right? A third of us feel lonely all the time. So trying to understand what that means in terms of home really starts to change how we do this. So the question is, what really is loneliness? Can we define it? Loneliness is kind of like hunger, right? You have this feeling when you get hungry. There's this pain in your stomach that your brain tells you, hey, you haven't ate in a while. It's time to worry about when the next meal's coming. Loneliness is a similar evolved instinct. It's this cognitive alarm in your brain that's telling you, hey, we've been separated from the tribe. I haven't seen anybody in a long time. We're in trouble. And your brain will not let it go, right? And for some people, they're more sensitive to that alarm, but that's what it is, right? And it can feel as painful as being wildly hungry. The problem is you're not supposed to feel that for prolonged periods of time. It actually increases your chance of a heart attack by about 30%. So you're not supposed to feel that, but many of us do. Many more of us felt that over the last 2 or 3 years. So this loneliness now becomes a problem because when I go to housing conferences, I see charts like this all the time. Sometimes phrased as a good thing. This is the percentage of growth of one-person households in America. And we'll say, yeah, the economy is growing. Yeah, but what kind of quality of life are we providing, right? If this is the growth of the one-person household, my question is, well, how many of these people and how much are we growing this problem of isolation? The reason I ask it is 36 million people live alone in this country. An existence that, under a different context, is the form of punishment we reserve for the most violent criminals we have, right? Psychologically, we know a lot about the implications and effect of solitary confinement on prisoners. I never hear that brought up at a housing conference. Never, right? But over the last 2-3 years, there's a big, huge sector of our population that went weeks on end without seeing a single human being, right? And then we wonder why everything's getting so toxic and people act different than they did, and school board meetings have become the way they have, right? This idea of loneliness has now changed, I think, our behavior. And it's not, I think, a surprise. When you look at the research for the cognitive decline of solitary confinement prisoners, prisoners with only contact with the food tray shoved through a slot became catatonic and developed autistic features, regressing to throwing food and playing with their feces within 5 days. Right? How many of your grandparents went 5 days without seeing another human being over COVID? Right? This is a real thing, and we're not using the information we know and applying it to the housing sector. So what do you do about it, right? You can think about community in a really simple way. The way we understand the word community is how we perceive our role in the triangulation of 3 types of places. First place is home, second place is work, third place is like the Cheers song where everybody knows your name, right? That's how you remember it. Different way to think about it is home is a realm of privacy, work is a realm of purpose, these third places are realms of fellowship. You need an everyday routine that allows you equitable access to these on a regular basis. The second you don't, your level of attachment, happiness, and belonging drop to nothing. So understanding how to get these back into neighborhoods that were built as monocultures, where there was only housing, or there's only office space, or there was only retail, becomes a huge challenge. And we have to understand that housing has a huge role in this, because that's my frame of reference, that's my North Star, that's my home base. Right? I access all these other things from my home, if I'm lucky enough to be able to. And as I age, my ability to access these things likely change. You can say I live in a great neighborhood. If I say, okay, but tomorrow you can't drive, what's your opinion of that neighborhood now? Right? Can you walk to get toilet paper? Right? These things are important now. So big question is, how many people here are regulars? You could walk into a third place right now and someone would say, hey, Norm. Show of hands. Okay, how many of you can walk or ride a bike to that location? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Dozen. Right? All those people statistically will live longer than the rest of you. Sorry, spoiler alert. There's a chance to change. You still can change it, but that's the reality of it. So we have to understand kind of what that means. Especially housing's role of it. We're getting really sophisticated at measuring these things, right? There's Google Walk Score, AARP's Livability Index, Blue Zone's Life Radius, all these things you can type in an address and can tell you how successful this place is. What it is an algorithm. It's trying to measure how much stuff is within that address. So a walk score will say, we have a walk score of 72, which is just a really simple way of saying, we've weighted all the third places within a quarter mile, and it seems like you have a bunch. The problem with this is they do a really good job of telling you how many good bars live near your house. They don't do a good job at all of telling you how many good bartenders live next to your house. And there is an enormous difference, right? And we have a much harder time understanding the value of that. And that's part of our problem. We're counting the wrong thing. A better phrase for it would be, we got to figure out a more sophisticated way to measure social capital. Right? And that is the value you assign to these relationships. It is not the quality of that restaurant or the walk score of that neighborhood. Is the fact that that woman right there, when I come every morning, remembers my name, knows what I like to drink, and asks me how I've been doing since my wife died 6 months ago. That's why I come back. Right? It's not because of a Yelp score or a walkability index analysis. It's because she remembered my name. Right? And we got to figure out a way to prioritize and incentivize that type of training and development if we're going to be sustainable moving forward. Because how we measure this matters. Because people will say, oh, social capital is a soft science. You know, Zach, you're just being Zach. True. But look at something like breast cancer, okay? Women with a large network of friends are 4 times more likely to survive breast cancer than those with sparser networks. 400% more likely, right? And when I say dense networks, we're talking about people you see physically on a regular basis. So if that doesn't count for something, I don't know what does. Right? So when we talk about the cost of value and all these nonsense conversations, when we talk about mixed-use development, these are the things we should be measuring. Right? And housing is a huge component to this discussion. So let's talk about social capital. What does that mean? When we talked about reducing the chance of premature death, we talked about close relationships and social integration. If you Google that, that's not likely the phrase you're going to get. What you're going to find is these 2 words called bonded and bridge relationships. So bonded relationships are your real friends. These are the folks that would actually come pick you up at the airport if you called. People that really like you. Bonded relationships are these bridge networks. These are people you kind of know, respect, want to have a reputation that they understand and appreciate. These are 6 degrees away from Kevin Bacon. This is your gateway to opportunity. They're 2 very different things. The difference is you need to be able to access and sustain both types of relationships simultaneously. So your bonded relationships largely create an environment out of the home. That's usually where they start, and that's where they grow from. Bridge relationships are what you usually do in terms of your access to people that you've met through work or these social hubs, these third places. And the trick is to try to understand how to balance both of them. When you can kind of get a sense of doing that with some sense of autonomy over a period of time, you get to feel what they call happy. That's what happiness is. It's the exact same, it's the inverse of the feeling your brain told you when you were lonely. You're like, hey, your brain's happy because it feels like we belong, feels like we're in a good spot, feels like we're being valued, and I have this cognitive allergy of not feeling like I belong. Right? People are getting me, they're adding me, they understand and appreciate what I bring to the tribe. Right? I feel happy. The difference is when we talk about economic development, it becomes it's really sexy to talk about happiness. The problem is when you spend all your energy worried about making people happy, you tend to only make happy people happier. You never make sad people happy. It's not how it works. So if given the choice, I think this is an important distinction. If you're given the choice when you talk about housing, economic development, you name it, in increasing happiness or reducing misery, always aim to reduce misery. Right? And there's a big difference, and it doesn't sell as well, especially on stages like this. But when we're talking about the epidemic of loneliness, that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about making people happy. We're talking about removing barriers, providing equitable placemaking, and removing misery in people's lives. How many people have seen this movie? I asked John, he wouldn't let me, I was going to show this movie as opposed to talking. If you need to know anything about housing, here's your dissertation. First 6 minutes of Up is a master class on what a home is, right? It's the overlap between the user group, the context, and the culture. And as those 3 things change, so does my perception of home. When my wife dies, home feels different all of a sudden. Right? When the neighborhood changes around me, home feels different all of a sudden. And it's a terrifying thing to realize my home might be taken away. Retirement communities deal with this all the time. They'll do these market catchment surveys, and most people on surveys will say, point blank, I'd rather die than live in a retirement community. A different way to say that is, I'd rather die than you take away my ability to control my everyday routine, even when you don't hardly have any control any longer. Right? You desperately fight tooth and nail to keep that autonomy, that perception of independence. Our idea and understanding of home has to recognize that's a normal human condition, and it's a defective reality of a bad neighborhood. So let's look at a survey. I like this survey. So in light blue are people that admit they have a high level of engagement in the world around them. Dark blue are people that will say publicly, I have a high level of engagement in the world around me. This survey didn't count how engaged people were, how often they left the house, how many boards of directors they sit on, none of that. They just asked, when you look in the mirror in the morning, how do you feel? I feel engaged. Okay, you go over here. How do you feel? I don't feel that engaged. Okay, you move over here. And we'll ask you a couple big philosophical questions. The one on the left is, are you satisfied with your life the majority of the time? 30% drop in those willing to say yes to that question if you separate out those two groups. The middle one is, are you able to make choices that about how you age? 24% gap. The one on the right is, do you have a high quality of life? 40% gap. Just in my ability to self-identify as engaged. I'm not even counting if and you actually are engaged. Just, I feel like I'm appreciated. I feel like I'm not a prisoner of my own home. Right? And that matters. It matters a lot to how we see these big philosophical questions. So I think it forces us to rethink the neighborhood at the neighborhood scale. So in 1930s, a traditional neighborhood would be in a dense place, right? Everyone knows a historic downtown. You went to a central location to get stuff. Milk, eggs, a hammer, a chance at a girlfriend. Like, you knew where to go because that's where everything happened, right? We traded that for something that kind of looked like this, right, diagrammatically. The promise of suburbia was efficiency and single-point destinations. We'll make it easier for you to get to one place. What it took away from us, and I don't think we realized at the time, is it took away from us the accidental encounter. And we undervalued what that was worth. It took away the possibility of you accidentally running into someone you might know. Right? The average Hoosier lives about 4 miles away from toilet paper. I'll stick with my toilet paper example. If you were to go get toilet paper now, the chance of you running into a friend likely in this state would only occur if someone was actually at Walmart or Dollar General at the same time shopping for the same product. And as soon as you're done, you get back in your car and go home. It completely eliminated that ability to accidentally bump into somebody. Right? So this idea of social integration, right? I know someone that has seen me repeatedly act the way I do in public, and that's how I built my reputation, my personal brand. That's how I defined my career path and my trajectory to success, was taken away in one fell swoop, one promise of efficiency. And then 2008 happened. And then we thought, this might not be so good of an idea. And you started to see communities really try to understand and right-size neighborhoods at the pedestrian scale for anything more to try to understand our access to goods and services. And you started to see this resurgence of walkable, denser urban villages. This is an easy thing to change and pivot on as a community when you're talking about building new neighborhoods. It's a much more difficult problem to reconcile ones that were done poorly, right? A better way to think about it is if you buy a bad dishwasher, that's a 3-year mistake. If you put a cul-de-sac in the wrong spot, that's a 150-year mistake. And urban planners all over the country now are trying to figure out how to solve 150-year mistakes in the next 5 years. And they're doing it in a way that's trying to leverage and incentivize these connections, this ability to cultivate place attachment through the introduction of housing and everything that surrounds it. The other thing you can get is, when we talk about housing, is the diversity of housing options. So they come in all shapes and sizes. You have this wonderful toolbox of different types of housing that you can use in certain situations. The benefit is the more diverse, the better. And we're getting better at trying to understand that. So here's a couple examples locally that I think are interesting. This is Piper Trail. This is a housing development on the southwest side of town. It's largely organized by a series of what they call pocket neighborhoods. So these are back-fed garages The back door is the front door, like all the lake people, right? You never call the front door the right one. They're all centered around a shared common lawn, and everyone is within a specific cognitive distance that people of all ages and abilities can recognize facial expressions from the porch. There's a real sweet spot where I'm sitting on my porch. If you're sitting in yours, I should be able to recognize whether or not you're smiling or not. It's really important to know if the guy across the street is frowning or smiling at you while he's waving, right? It helps. So there is some math behind that, and you can start to cluster these around that. These shared commons now become interesting public realm spaces that 7 homes now kind of take ownership of. Right? This is where they throw parties. This is where they throw cookouts, right? With no planning, with no governance, with no management. It's organic. And this is something that's happening right now in the private sector. The other is trying to think through urban living, mixed-use density, like the Landing. But what's interesting about this is not only the eyes on the street, which we could do a whole separate session on, but what I think is more interesting is trying to understand, especially at this density, making sure that a for-profit development like this still saves room to privatize the importance of social capital. So when we were designing the Landing, there's 2 real big questions that try to govern all the planning decisions. Where's the best place to propose? And what's the best spot to be at in a good snowball fight? These are important planning decisions. Trust me. The housing thing's easy. Having a spot that's worthy of an Instagram post or a proposal is why people use these places, right? To understand where that happens and why, making sure I'm leveraging that as best as I can to not only increase the wealth of the place, but introduce some excitement and vibrancy into the area, right? Because I want to propose to my girlfriend here. I likely don't live upstairs. We've come to the Landing. So now I got tourism for this specific purpose, right, of romance, which is an interesting way to talk about a neighborhood and its future. The other is affordable housing. I think we're getting a lot better at understanding how to creatively use things like low-income housing tax credits. Village Premier on the southeast side of town is going to leverage about 220 units, and I think a really interesting way that's going to then invest in a neighborhood and be able to be the reason we can also get in subsequent phases a whole series of retail mixed-use development, right? Using that as the first phase to supplement future growth. And the last one I'll share is a sizable development on the northeast side of town called Providence Place, just east of Parkview, PRMC, that in any direction within a 5-minute walk has an array of one extreme to another in terms of diversity. In that picture, if you go from bottom to top, you go from 222 apartments to row housing to cottage living to senior living. When you go from left to right, it ranges from a clinic to a winery, right? All on 82 acres, all done by the private sector, all being done and breaking ground soon. So we're starting to see some of that. So I think when we talk about why housing matters, I think it's important to understand the difference between treating a home as a place to fortify some sense of privacy and protect you from the world around you, and pivot that and try to appreciate the fact that this isn't where I end my day, it's the springboard in which I start my day. This is where I go to explore the world and come home. It's not a place I try to protect against my neighbors or the world around us. The reason that I think housing matters is because it's our North Star, right? We need people more than we ever want to admit, and where and how our housing is built allows us to do that, either in a really ineffective way or something that adds a lot of value and happiness to our everyday routine. So I'll leave it for questions. Yeah, I was supposed to end at 2:54. I ended at 2:55.
John told Zach he'd buy him a beer if he stuck the landing on time. I think a minute buffer, you earned that drink. Do we have any questions from the audience? We have time for 1 or 2. I'll go ahead and get started. Zach, what can Sesame Street teach us about inclusive and creative placemaking?
That's my favorite question. So Sesame Street. So everybody will talk about walkability. I think it's an interesting thing that's often misunderstood, especially by Hoosiers. So the number one complaint in most discussions, especially with the community, is, well, you can't park within 10 feet of my door, so no one shops at this establishment, which is not true. But we don't understand walkability, really. So if you Google it, it'll say, well, you should be able to walk 3/4 of a mile in 10 minutes. It's not true, and 2, that's not how it works. you can learn how to better understand walkability by learning a little bit about Sesame Street. So my favorite thing about Sesame Street, did you ever notice Oscar the Grouch doesn't teach you anything? Nothing, right? He's there for comic relief. So when they designed Sesame Street, they did it through a whole series of really exhaustive time studies. They threw a bunch of toys on the ground, watched through a one-way mirror, and watched these kids, whether they watched TV or played with the toys. And when they disengaged, what brought them back to the TV? There's like kind of sweet science for this. They got really good at it with Blue's Clues, so good that it's hard to watch. But in Sesame Street, what they did is they understood that the appearance of Oscar the Grouch in Sesame Street is specifically spaced by the cognitive endurance of a 5-year-old. Right? So I can teach you something for 2 minutes, you got to rest. Teach you something for 2 minutes, you got to rest. Now I got you for 5 minutes, you got to rest. And all those resting moments is when you saw Oscar, when you're watching Sesame Street. Because I didn't want you to leave, because if you leave, it's hard to get you back. So I'll let your brain rest, but you got to stay engaged. This is the same with walkability. I'm walk a lot farther if you sprinkle some Oscar moments in this walk. If there's nothing and it's just hell on earth and asphalt, I'm willing to walk from here to the door, and that's about it. So think about it as how far you'll walk at Walmart versus how far you'll walk in Chicago. Right? If you got a parking spot within 100 feet of a door in Fort Wayne, you complain. If you've got a parking spot a mile away from a Broadway show, you'd brag about that spot. Parking was easy. It wasn't that bad. Because that walk is part of the experience. It's part of the date. And understanding that kind of moment of Oscar is kind of how you have to understand economic development. You have to triangulate these with these kind of breadcrumbs of interest, because we just don't have the cognitive capacity or endurance to handle this when things are unwalkable.
Okay, if nobody else has a question, I have one for Zach. I've heard a little bit of conversation that we have an issue with student housing. That's come up once or twice.
I heard.
Can you talk about best practices in student housing that you've seen?
I won't, and here's why. One, that's not my job. Two, I think it's dangerous. It's possible, but it's dangerous to invest in monocultures. You can do it in a campus setting, but when you're talking about, anybody seen the documentary Pruitt-Igoe? Oh, do that tonight. Pruitt-Igoe. It was the first and probably most catastrophic failure of the affordable housing. It's like Robert Taylor Homes. It was the version in New York. I had a mentor once that said 6 of anything's a ghetto, right? And that 6 of anything is defined by what I perceive on the sidewalk. So student housing's fine, but anything that looks that repetitive can quickly become a monoculture. And monocultures are hard to rebound from, especially over a generation. So they tend to hold excitement for the first-time users, but when they roll over, they start to decline quickly. And every iteration, that gets worse and worse and worse. And then as a community, you're stuck in trying to figure out what to do with this product that now no one wants. So I think when we talk about, I heard the number like 2,500 housing units, right? And that's a town, which could be a terrifying goal or the most exciting opportunity we've had in a long time to try to understand. The trick will be how to pull off that scale of housing without it being a monoculture, right? Without it feeling like a monotonous array of homes that we had to build in a hurry.
But excellence is possible through excellent design.
Anything's possible.
Excellent. I love that. Okay, we have time for one quick question before we wrap it up.
It's really more a comment, maybe asking for some feedback. I live in one of those 1960s neighborhoods that was developed on a cul-de-sac, and I started observing years ago that I felt like the accidental encounter that you mentioned might be a byproduct of the attached garage and the mailbox you can drive up to. I just wondered any observations you might have about that, because we've tried to intentionally walk to our mailbox every day so we can encounter our neighbors.
The biggest problem with conventional suburban living is it has no semi-private space. And that's a big difference. So you want private space, everyone wants their own privacy, but you also have this aperture that you let the world around you know you're willing to engage, right? That's why the front porch was so valuable. It still is private space. It's weird if a stranger's on your front porch, right? But you're sitting out on the porch to let everyone know that walks by, I'd really like a conversation if you're willing, right? And that semi-private zone disappeared in the 60s. But it's also frustrating to realize that everyone can complain about suburban living, but have you ever noticed how unwalkable it is on one day and then walk it on garage sale day. It's night and day. And all we've introduced is this like guerrilla retail, and all of a sudden everyone's talking, and I can walk up your driveway and no one cares. Right? You're just walking in strangers' houses, looking at their stuff, and everyone's cool with it. And that's just because the group just decided, well, today we're going to be social, right? So I think there just needs to be more purposeful decisions that we don't like living like this as a group, and we're going to take some ownership to change it. And I do think that used to be one of the primary focuses of a neighborhood association, and it no longer is. That people complain about zoning ordinances like they're not rules we impose on ourselves. You can change these things. You got to go to a couple meetings and drop a gavel and new rules. When we talk about neighborhood management, it's the same way. All you need is like 3 people, and you can change the world. You just need to all agree on what days we're going to act like humans, and then slowly people get the hang of it again. Garage sale day.
All right, well, let's thank Zach.